Hi, it's Catherine here from wiseoldowl.slt.com. This week I'd like to tell you about developmental verbal dyspraxia, or in America it's known as childhood apraxia. And so it's the awareness week this week for dyspraxia, apraxia, and I just wanted to tell you a little bit about it because I come across it often in my field of work, and it's useful for you if you're working in nurseries or early years settings to be able to identify which children might need early identification. So dyspraxia, you may have heard of dyspraxia as a sort of general developmental dyspraxia where there are issues with coordination, but verbal dyspraxia or developmental verbal dyspraxia really just affects the muscles of the mouth, so the tongue, the lips, the vocal folds, so the voice. You can also have developmental verbal dyspraxia along with general dyspraxia as well. With verbal dyspraxia, the best way I explain it to my parents is there's nothing wrong with the child's brain, there's nothing wrong with the child's muscles, but the neural pathways between the brain and the muscles are just not fully developed. It's likely that they will become fully developed, but only after a lot of time, effort and intervention. So some of the telltale symptoms of developmental verbal dyspraxia, you might recognise them quite early on, maybe when a child's even 2, although generally a diagnosis of verbal dyspraxia might not happen until they're about 6 or 7. So some of the telltale signs are feeding issues as a baby. If the baby has a poor suck or has difficulty coordinating that suck, swallow, breathe, suck, swallow, breathe, then that might be a telltale sign. Often they'll choke or gag on their milk or food because they haven't got the coordination to transfer the food or the drink safely to the back of their throat, because obviously the muscles involved in feeding are the same as the muscles involved with eating. Another way you might tell, perhaps when your child is 2 or 3, is if they go to lick an ice lolly. If you put an ice lolly in front of them, they might just do but not actually stick their tongue out to lick. And likewise, if you ask them for a kiss, although it's quite typical for young children just to purse their lips but not do anything, as they get a little bit older they do get that, that bringing the lips together and apart, but sometimes children with developmental verbal dyspraxia find that quite difficult as well. The other thing that you might notice is that the language will be delayed when they're young. So perhaps they've got fantastic attention and listening skills. They're completely socially interacting with you. They understand everything that you're saying, but maybe they're just not been babbling very much, or they've got a very limited range of babbling. So they might say bye because that's quite automatic, but if you were to say to them say bye, then it's that voluntary rather than the automatic speech that they have difficulty with. So you might actually notice a child lick their lips to get a little bit of yogurt off their lips, but if you were to actually ask them to lick their lips, then you might notice a little bit of groping going on, where they're trying to move the muscles but they're not quite getting it right. So that delayed talking with the reduced babbling as well could perhaps be indicating a difficulty at the level of the speech, the coordination of the muscles. The next thing that you might want to look out for, again, well, I've mentioned it briefly, but that is the groping. And so perhaps if you're saying, say, P, then they might be doing an open vowel. They might be able to say E, but they might not be able to put their lips together. Or if you're trying to get them to say a F sound when they're a little bit older, say 3 or 4, they might use the bottom teeth on their top lip, or they might do the sound that they've heard you do just before. So if a child is able to say a S for a Sammy snake, and then you ask them to say another sound, they might perseverate. That means they might get stuck on the same sound before because their muscles have just done it and their muscle memory is formed for that particular sound. So developmental verbal dyspraxia is not something that a child is just going to grow out of. And so in actual fact, we do quite like, as speech and language therapists, to see them a little bit earlier, because it's unlikely that they're going to get there by themselves. So if your child has a very limited range of consonants, or maybe even if their vowels are disordered, because that's another thing that can happen with developmental verbal dyspraxia. Generally, you don't have vowel issues with other types of speech sound difficulties, but with developmental verbal dyspraxia, their vowels might be way off as well, which sometimes gives them a bit of a different accent from the accent that you have. But the kind of things then that we would be looking out for, wanting to have to see children a little bit earlier, would be if they've got that limited or no babbling as a baby, if they've been very, very quiet as a baby, if they are kind of struggling to eat, or they're sometimes choking on their food, or they don't perhaps tolerate lumpy food as much as smooth food because they're finding the chewing difficult, or if they're doing kind of groping actions with their tongue and their teeth and their lips, then those might be early signposts for you to seek the help of a speech and language therapist. So if you were perhaps to do my speech sound assessment on your child and every sound was difficult for them, then obviously you're not just going to hope that they're going to grow out of it. You would actually like them to be seen, because children with developmental verbal dyspraxia can be severely unintelligible. So perhaps you as a parent might be very tuned into what they're saying. Other people find them really, really difficult to understand. And if that's the case, then you probably would want them to be seen by a speech and language therapist earlier rather than later. I hope that this has been useful. I will put some links in my blog to useful handouts, useful websites if you have a child who has developmental verbal dyspraxia. Sometimes speech and language therapists don't actually diagnose. Sometimes they might just describe the child's speech as showing having dyspraxic type tendencies. But it's really important to get that diagnosis so that you can be looking at giving intervention on a very, very regular basis, because you get to know your speech and language therapist because you'll be seeing them for a few years, but I guarantee that they will get there in the end.